Chapter 1. The day everything felt wrong. I woke up before the alarm, not because I was rested, but because something inside me refused to stay asleep. The room was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that feels heavy instead of peaceful. Morning light slipped through the thin gap in the curtains, landing softly on the wall, exactly the way it always did. Nothing was different. And yet, everything felt wrong. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the familiar sense of urgency to arrive, the mental list of things to do, people to please, problems to manage. It didn't come. What replaced it was emptiness. Not calm, not relief, just a hollow pause where my thoughts used to be. I finally got out of bed and walked into the bathroom. The floor was cold under my feet. I turned on the light and looked up, expecting to see myself. Instead, I saw a stranger. The woman in the mirror looked tired, but not in the way sleep could fix. Her eyes were open, yet distant, as if she was watching life from behind glass. Her face was familiar in structure, but something essential was missing. I leaned closer, studying the reflection, searching for recognition. "Is this really me?" I whispered. The mirror didn't answer. I brushed my teeth on autopilot, my hand moving without intention. The sound of the brush was loud in the small space, mechanical, repetitive. I watched my mouth form shapes that didn't belong to any emotion. When I smiled, just to test it, the muscles moved, but the feeling didn't follow. The smile felt borrowed. In the kitchen, the coffee machine hummed to life. The smell of coffee filled the air, warm and comforting, the way it always had been. This used to be my favorite part of the day, a small ritual that made everything else feel manageable. That morning, it felt like nothing. I held the mug in my hands, noticing the heat, noticing the weight, noticing everything except myself. I took a sip. No pleasure, no dislike, just sensation without meaning. Outside, the neighborhood was waking up. A car door slammed. Someone laughed in the distance. Life was moving forward at its usual pace, unaware that something in me had quietly stopped. I sat at the table and opened my phone, scrolling through messages and notifications. Birthdays, reminders, news headlines. None of it stirred anything inside me. I wasn't sad. I wasn't angry. I was absent. As I got dressed, I chose clothes that made sense rather than clothes I liked. Neutral colors, safe shapes, the kind of outfit that wouldn't draw attention or invite questions. I tied my shoes carefully, as if precision could anchor me back into my body. It didn't. On the drive to work, I followed the same route I had taken for years. Turned left, stop sign, long straight road lined with trees. I knew every crack in the pavement, every traffic light by heart. At one red light, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror again. There she was, watching, waiting, silent. A thought surfaced, uninvited, and sharp. I was living my life, but I wasn't in it anymore. The realization didn't explode, it settled, heavy, certain. At work, people greeted me the way they always did. "Morning. You look tired. Busy day ahead." I nodded, smiled when expected, answered when spoken to. From the outside, I was functioning perfectly, competent, reliable. normal. Inside, I felt like I was fading. I completed tasks without remembering starting them, sent emails without recalling their content. Time passed in strange, uneven chunks. Minutes stretched, hours disappeared. When I laughed at a joke during a meeting, the sound surprised me. It didn't feel like it came from me. During lunch, I sat alone at my desk instead of joining my coworkers. I told myself I needed the quiet. The truth was, I didn't trust myself to hold a conversation. I was afraid someone would ask a simple question like, "How are you?" and something honest would slip out. I didn't know how to explain what was wrong because nothing was obviously wrong. No tragedy, no argument, no sudden loss. Just a slow erosion I hadn't noticed until there was barely anything left. In the afternoon, I caught my reflection again in the dark screen of my computer. For a brief second, I felt a surge of panic. When did this happen? I tried to trace it back, a moment, a decision, a turning point, but there was nothing clear. No single day where I could say, "This is when I lost myself." It felt like it had happened quietly, in pieces. Each time I said yes when I wanted to say no. Each time I stayed silent to keep the peace. Each time I chose responsibility over desire. Each time I told myself I would come back to myself later. Later never came. On the way home, the sky turned gray, thick with clouds that promised rain. I rolled down the window, hoping the cold air would wake something inside me. It didn't. The world felt distant, like I was moving through it wrapped in invisible layers. At a stoplight, I watched a woman crossing the street. She was laughing into her phone, animated, alive. For reasons I couldn't explain, my chest tightened. I missed that version of myself, the one that felt present, the one that reacted instead of analyzed, the one that lived instead of performed. When I got home, I stood in the doorway longer than necessary, keys still in my hand. The house was quiet, orderly, exactly as I had left it. I dropped my bag on the floor and sat on the couch without turning on the lights. Dusk filled the room, soft and blue. I stared at nothing, listening to my own breathing. That was when the quiet shock fully landed. Not a scream, not a breakdown, just a deep, unsettling awareness. I wasn't exhausted from doing too much. I was exhausted from being absent from my own life. Tears welled up, but they didn't fall. Even crying felt distant, like something that belonged to another version of me. I pressed my hands together, grounding myself in the physical sensation, trying to prove I was still here. "I don't know where I went," I said out loud. The words hung in the air, unanswered. That night, as darkness settled and the world outside continued without noticing my internal collapse, one truth became impossible to ignore. The day everything felt wrong was not the day my life fell apart. It was the day I realized I had quietly disappeared from it, and I had no idea how to find my way back. Chapter 2. When life became a routine I couldn't feel. Life didn't change all at once. That was the most confusing part. There was no dramatic shift, no moment where everything broke. Instead, my days began to line up neatly, one after another, like identical boxes stacked too carefully to notice what was missing inside them. I woke up at the same time every morning. I followed the same routine. I played the same roles, and everyone around me seemed satisfied with that. I went to the same job I had held for years, a job people described as stable, respectable, something to be grateful for. I knew my responsibilities so well I could complete them without thinking. My hands moved faster than my mind. My answers came automatically. Can you handle this? Of course. You're so reliable. I try. Those words followed me everywhere. Reliable, responsible, steady. They sounded like compliments. They felt like chains. At work, my calendar filled itself weeks in advance. Meetings, deadlines, expectations. I moved from one task to the next without resistance, without excitement, without question. I wasn't unhappy there. I wasn't happy either. I was neutral. During lunch breaks, I sat with coworkers and listened to conversations flow around me. Complaints about traffic, weekend plans, small victories, small frustrations. I nodded at the right moments, smiled when laughter appeared. No one noticed that my laughter arrived a second too late. If someone asked how I was doing, I said what I always said. Fine. The word had become effortless, smooth, convincing. After work, I went home and stepped back into another role, family member, partner, the one who remembered birthdays, managed schedules, kept things running. I cooked meals I had cooked 100 times before. I cleaned surfaces that never seemed to stay clean. I listened to stories I could predict before they finished. How was your day? Good. Tired. Same as usual. Same. The house was full, yet I often felt alone inside it. Conversations happened around me, not with me. My presence was expected, but my absence, emotional absence, went unnoticed. When people looked at me, they saw someone who had it together. She's doing well. She handles everything. She's strong. I heard those words and felt a strange disconnect, as if they were describing someone who lived in my body but wasn't me. Inside, there was a constant quiet hum of exhaustion, not the kind that sleep could fix, a deeper tiredness, the kind that comes from being present everywhere except within yourself. I tried to remember when the last time I had felt excited about something, truly excited, not polite enthusiasm, not obligation, real anticipation. Nothing came. I remembered moments instead, fragments of an earlier version of myself, the way I used to lose track of time when doing something I loved, the way my voice sounded lighter, freer, the way decisions felt guided by instinct instead of caution. That person felt distant now, like someone I had once known well but hadn't spoken to in years. Days passed, weeks passed. The rhythm never changed. Wake up, get ready, work, return home, repeat. Each day felt a slightly heavier than the last, though I couldn't explain why. There was no crisis to point to, no reason to complain. When I tried to name the problem, my mind pushed back. Be grateful. Others have it worse. Nothing is actually wrong. That last thought followed me everywhere. Nothing was wrong, and that scared me. Because if nothing was wrong, why did I feel so disconnected from my own life? At night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the day in reverse. Not because something had gone badly, but because I was searching for something, anything, that had made me feel alive. Some nights, I found nothing at all. I stopped sharing this feeling with others. It was too vague, too quiet, too hard to explain without sounding ungrateful or dramatic. How do you tell someone you're slowly disappearing when there's no visible damage? So, I kept going. I kept fulfilling expectations. I kept saying yes. I kept showing up. And with every choice that prioritized stability over honesty, The distance between who I was and who I felt myself becoming grew wider. I noticed it in small ways. I stopped playing music in the car. I stopped choosing restaurants I loved. I stopped voicing preferences. "It doesn't matter," I said often. At first, it was true. Later, it became a habit. People around me felt comfortable because I was easy, flexible, adaptable. I didn't challenge plans. I didn't ask for much. I didn't make waves. What they didn't see was the quiet cost of that ease. Each time I dismissed a desire, I taught myself it wasn't important. Each time I stayed silent, I reinforced the idea that my voice was optional. Each time I postponed my needs, I pushed myself further into the background. Over time, I began to feel like a guest in my own life, present, polite, unnecessary. There were moments when panic flickered briefly, like a warning light. In the grocery store aisle, choosing between brands, I would suddenly freeze, overwhelmed by a decision that shouldn't have mattered. In conversations, I would lose focus, drifting inward, missing words. But the feeling always passed. And when it did, I told myself everything was fine. That word again. Fine. It became my shield. The truth was quieter and harder to face. I wasn't broken. I wasn't failing. I wasn't lost in a dramatic sense. I was slowly erasing myself in exchange for comfort, approval, and predictability. No one forced me to do it. That was the part that hurt the most. I had chosen this life step by step, believing that if I did everything right, fulfillment would arrive eventually, that there would be a moment where I could finally rest, finally feel whole. But rest never came. Only repetition, only numbness, only the growing sense that I was moving forward without actually going anywhere. One evening, as I stood in the kitchen washing dishes, I caught my reflection in the darkened window. For a second, I didn't recognize the person staring back, not because she looked different, because she looked empty. I turned away quickly, my chest tightening. I wasn't ready to confront what that meant. But somewhere beneath the routine, beneath the roles, beneath the carefully managed life, a quiet truth was forming. Identity loss doesn't arrive loudly. It happens slowly, invisibly, while everything else appears perfectly normal. And by the time you notice it, you're already far from where you started. Chapter 3. The moment I realized I was missing. The moment didn't arrive with force. It slipped into my day quietly, disguised as something ordinary, something so small I almost ignored it. I was cleaning out a drawer I hadn't opened in years, not because I wanted to, but because I needed something to do with my hands. The drawer held old papers, tangled cables, forgotten objects that had outlived their usefulness. I sorted through them without thinking, tossing what I didn't need, keeping what felt familiar. At the bottom, beneath envelopes and receipts, I found a photograph. It was slightly bent at the corners, the edges soft from time. I stared at it for a long moment before recognizing myself. I was younger in the photo, not dramatically younger, but lighter somehow. My posture was different, open, relaxed. I was smiling without effort, my eyes bright in a way that startled me. I was standing outdoors, sunlight on my face, hair pulled back carelessly. There was no sign of the caution I carried now. I held the photo closer, studying it as if it belonged to a stranger. I didn't remember the moment it was taken. I didn't remember what I had been doing that day or why I had been smiling like that. What I remembered instead was the feeling it stirred. Longing. Not for the past itself, but for the version of me that existed in it. I sat down on the floor, the photo resting in my hands, and felt something shift inside my chest. A subtle crack, the kind that doesn't hurt immediately, but changes the shape of everything around it. Who was I then? And when had I stopped being her? The question lingered, uncomfortable and persistent. Later that evening, as if the day wasn't finished with me yet, my phone buzzed. A message appeared from an unknown number. At first, I assumed it was spam. Then I read it. "Hey, I don't know if you still use this number, but I found an old email from you today and thought of you. I hope you're still writing." Writing. The word hit me harder than it should have. I hadn't written anything in years, not seriously, not for myself. It used to be the way I made sense of the world, the way I processed emotion, the way I felt close to myself. I stared at the message, my thumb hovering over the screen. How do you respond to a reminder of something you quietly abandoned? I didn't answer. I put the phone down and went about my evening, but the message followed me everywhere. It echoed while I cooked, while I washed dishes, while I stood in the shower letting the water run too long. Still writing. The question felt almost cruel. That night, I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to remember the last time I had done something purely because it mattered to me. Not because it was useful, not because it made life easier for others, not because it fit into a schedule. I struggled to find an answer. The next day, the third trigger arrived. I was standing in line at a coffee shop, half aware, my thoughts drifting the way they often did. A child stood in front of me with her mother, swinging her legs impatiently. She turned around suddenly and looked up at me. "What do you want to be?" she asked. Her mother laughed softly. "She means when you grow up." The question was innocent, unfiltered, uncalculated. I opened my mouth to answer. Nothing came out. I felt heat rise in my face. I smiled awkwardly and said something vague, something safe. "I'm already grown up," I replied. The child frowned, unimpressed. "Yeah, but what do you want?" I had no answer. The mother apologized, pulling her daughter closer, but the damage was done. The question followed me out of the shop and into the street, clinging to me like a shadow. What do you want? I walked home slowly, the world feeling sharper, louder. Every sound felt amplified. Every thought felt closer to the surface. Back in my apartment, I sat at the table and stared at the photograph again, then at my phone, then at my empty hands. It all came together then, not as a dramatic realization, but as a quiet, devastating understanding. My dreams hadn't died. They had been postponed, again and again, for later, for when things settled, for when it made sense. My emotions hadn't disappeared. They had been silenced, pushed down to keep things stable, to avoid conflict, to avoid inconvenience. My needs hadn't vanished. They had been ignored, slowly, methodically, by me. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of it pressing into my chest. Somewhere along the way, I stopped being myself to keep everything else together. The sentence formed clearly in my mind, undeniable and painful. I had chosen consistency over honesty, comfort over curiosity, approval over authenticity, not because anyone forced me to, because it felt safer. I thought about all the moments I swallowed words, the times I told myself it wasn't important, the days I stayed quiet because speaking felt too risky. Each choice made sense on its own. Together, they erased me. Tears welled up, surprising me with their intensity. I wasn't grieving a failure or a loss I could explain. I was grieving myself. The version of me who used to dream without guilt. The version of me who felt deeply without apologizing. The version of me who knew what she wanted, or at least believed she was allowed to want something. I pressed my hands to my face and let the tears fall, my body shaking with something that felt like relief and fear at the same time. Relief because I finally understood what was wrong. Fear because awareness changes things. Once you see yourself disappearing, you can't unsee it. I stayed there for a long time, letting the realization settle, letting it hurt. The numbness that had protected me for so long was cracking, and in its place was something raw and alive, painful, but real. When I finally stood up, the world looked the same. The room hadn't changed, the schedule hadn't changed, the expectations hadn't changed, but I had. The quiet certainty that followed me now was unsettling and unavoidable. I was missing from my own life, and for the first time, I wasn't willing to pretend that was okay. I didn't become everything for everyone overnight. It happened gradually, in moments so small they felt harmless at the time. The first time I stayed quiet instead of saying I was tired. The first time I agreed even though my chest tightened. The first time I told myself, it's easier if I just handle it. Those moments piled up, unnoticed, until they formed the shape of my life. I was the strong one. When something went wrong, people looked to me. When decisions had to be made, I made them. When emotions ran high, I stayed calm. I learned early that strength made people comfortable. It kept things moving. It kept things stable. You're so strong, they said. I don't know how you do it, they said. I smiled and accepted the praise, even as something inside me shrank. I was the reliable one. If I promised something, it was done. If someone needed help, I showed up. I remembered details others forgot. I anticipated needs before they were spoken. I carried the invisible weight that kept everything balanced. It felt good at first to be needed, to be trusted. Reliability gave me a sense of purpose when I didn't know what else to reach for. But over time, reliability turned into expectation. People stopped asking if I could help. They assumed I would. They didn't notice when it cost me something, because I never let it show. I was the one who never complained. When things became heavy, I swallowed the discomfort. When I felt overwhelmed, I told myself others had it worse. When resentment flickered, I pushed it down quickly, ashamed of it. Complaining felt selfish, weak, unnecessary. I told myself that adulthood meant endurance, that maturity meant sacrifice, that wanting more was a sign of immaturity, not courage. So I stayed quiet. On the outside, my life looked composed, functional, even admirable. People saw a person who had it together. Inside, I felt like I was carrying a weight that kept increasing, one unspoken obligation at a time. I started noticing the resentment in small flashes, when someone asked for help without hesitation, when plans were made without considering me, when my time was treated as flexible, expandable, infinite. The resentment scared me. I didn't want to be that person, the bitter one, the angry one, the one who kept score, so I immediately followed every flash of resentment with guilt. I chose this. No one forced me. Why am I acting like a victim? The guilt was relentless. I told myself I had no right to feel empty. I had a job, a family, a routine that worked. People depended on me. So why did I feel so hollow? That question haunted me more than exhaustion ever could. Some nights I lay awake replaying conversations, wondering where I could have spoken up. Other nights, I imagined what it would feel like to disappear for a while. Not permanently, just enough to rest. That thought scared me. Wanting to disappear felt dangerously close to wanting to escape, and wanting to escape felt like betrayal to the people who relied on me, to the version of myself I had worked so hard to become. I didn't want to abandon my life. I just wanted to stop carrying it alone. During the day, I functioned well. I smiled at the right moments. I answered messages promptly. I did what was expected of me. But there was a growing tension inside my chest, a tightness that never fully released. I felt trapped between two opposing truths. I wanted to be needed. I wanted to be free. I wanted to be dependable. I wanted to be honest. I wanted to disappear. I felt selfish for wanting more. The contradiction exhausted me. There were moments when I almost spoke up, moments when the words rose to the surface ready to be said. I'm tired. I need help. This is too much. But each time, another voice intervened. Don't make it complicated. Don't disappoint anyone. You can handle this. And so I did, over and over again. Until one evening, standing in the kitchen, my hands shaking slightly as I finished cleaning up after a long day, I realized something unsettling. No one had asked me to be everything. I had volunteered. I had stepped into every gap, filled every silence, solved every problem before it became visible. I had trained people to rely on me by never allowing myself to falter. The realization didn't bring relief. It brought grief. Because it meant there was no one to blame but myself. I had built this life carefully, believing that being indispensable would protect me from being abandoned, that being strong would make me worthy, that being reliable would secure my place. Instead, it erased me. I looked around my quiet home and felt a sudden urge to scream, not out of anger, but out of sheer pressure. The walls felt too close. The air felt too thick. I wanted to run. I wanted to rest. I wanted someone else to take over. Immediately, guilt followed. How could you think that? This is your life. Other people would be grateful. Grateful. The word felt like a verdict. I sat down at the table and put my head in my hands, breathing slowly, trying to calm the storm inside me. The tension between resentment and guilt twisted tighter, leaving no space for peace. I realized then that my emptiness wasn't a mystery. It was the result of years of emotional labor performed without acknowledgement, even from myself. I had spent so long being everything for everyone that I forgot how to be anything for me. The weight wasn't just physical or emotional, it was existential. Who was I when I wasn't solving problems? Who was I when I wasn't holding things together? Who was I when I wasn't needed? The questions frightened me because I didn't know the answers. I had tied my identity to usefulness, to endurance, to silence. Letting go of that felt like stepping into nothingness, and yet, continuing like this felt unbearable. That was the conflict tightening inside me now, quiet, invisible, but growing stronger by the day. I didn't want to break. I didn't want to disappear. I didn't want to become bitter. But I also couldn't keep carrying the weight of everyone's expectations without collapsing under it. For the first time, I admitted something I had been avoiding for years. Being everything for everyone was costing me myself, and no amount of guilt could make that cost disappear.
Chapter 5. The Night I Finally Broke. It happened on a night that looked no different from any other. No raised voices, no slammed doors, no dramatic goodbye. The house was quiet, too quiet to hide behind. I finished everything I was supposed to finish. The dishes were done, the lights were turned off, The schedule for the next day was already planned in my head. I had performed my role well, as I always did. And then there was nothing left to do. I stood in the living room for a long moment, unsure where to go next. The couch felt too soft. The bedroom felt too close. I turned off the last lamp and let darkness settle around me, heavy and still. That was when it started. Not all at once, not loudly, just a pressure in my chest that wouldn't release. I sat down on the floor, my back against the couch, knees pulled in close. The cool surface grounded me for a second, and I focused on my breathing the way I'd learned years ago. Slow in, slow out. It didn't help. My throat tightened without warning. Tears came before I understood why. I pressed my hand to my mouth, instinctively trying to silence myself, as if someone might hear even though I was alone. I cried quietly at first, the kind of crying that tries to stay polite, controlled, apologetic. I didn't sob, I didn't shake. I just let the tears fall steadily, my shoulders tense, my jaw clenched, as if I could hold myself together through will alone. "I don't know what's wrong with me," I whispered. The words sounded strange in the empty room. Nothing had happened that day. No failure, no conflict, no loss I could point to. And yet, I felt completely undone. The tears kept coming. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, annoyed at myself for feeling so weak. I told myself to stop, to get up, to go to bed. But my body refused to move. It was as if something inside me had finally decided it couldn't hold on any longer. I tried to think through the feeling, the way I always did, to analyze it, to trace it back to a cause I could manage. Was I tired? Overwhelmed? Unappreciated? None of the answers felt complete. The truth sat deeper than that. As I cried there on the floor, my thoughts slowed for the first time in a long while. They didn't race ahead or spiral outward. They turned inward, settling on a single, unbearable realization. I didn't recognize the person I had become. The sentence landed with a quiet finality that left no room for argument. I closed my eyes and images surfaced uninvited. Me agreeing when I wanted to refuse. Me smiling when I wanted to speak. Me nodding along to a life that felt increasingly foreign. I saw myself moving through days like a shadow of who I used to be. Present, useful, invisible. I had changed so gradually that I hadn't noticed the transformation. There was no single decision that erased me, no dramatic sacrifice. Just a series of small choices that added up to a life where my inner world no longer mattered. I cried harder then, not because I was in pain, but because I finally understood what I had lost. I had lost my voice, not because someone took it, but because I stopped using it. I had lost my desires, not because they disappeared, but because I dismissed them. I had lost my sense of self, not because it broke, but because I neglected it. The grief that followed was deep and unfamiliar. This wasn't grief for a person or a moment in time. It was grief for myself, for the version of me who used to feel things without shame, for the version who believed her needs were valid, for the version who didn't measure her worth by how little she asked for. I pressed my forehead against my knees, my breathing uneven now, my body shaking with sobs I could no longer control. "I don't know how to be her anymore," I whispered into the dark. The room offered no answers. There was no villain to blame, no one to confront, no mistake I could undo with a single choice. Just the slow accumulation of years spent prioritizing everything but myself. That was the hardest part to accept. If someone had hurt me, I could have been angry. If something had been taken from me, I could have demanded it back. But this was quieter, more intimate, more painful. I had participated in my own disappearance.
The thought crushed me. I stayed there on the floor for a long time, letting the tears come and go in waves. Each wave left me a little emptier, a little lighter. The breakdown wasn't explosive. It was exhausting, draining, necessary. Eventually, the crying slowed. I lay back on the couch, staring up at the ceiling, my eyes burning, my face wet and swollen. My chest ached, but beneath the ache was something else, something fragile and unfamiliar. Clarity. For the first time, I wasn't pushing the feeling away, not trying to minimize it or make it manageable. I let it exist exactly as it was. And in that stillness, another truth surfaced. I couldn't keep living like this. Not because the life was bad, not because I was unhappy all the time, but because I was absent. Existing wasn't enough anymore. I didn't need a new life. I didn't need a dramatic change. I didn't need to run away. I needed to come back. The thought scared me almost as much as it comforted me. Coming back meant facing everything I had been avoiding. It meant risking disappointment, mine and others. It meant learning how to listen to myself again after years of ignoring that voice. I sat up slowly, my body heavy but steady. The room looked the same. The darkness felt less oppressive now. I wiped my face and took a deep breath, feeling it all the way down into my chest. "I'm still here," I said quietly. The words felt tentative, uncertain, but they were true. That night didn't fix anything. It didn't give me a plan or a solution. It didn't magically restore what I had lost. But it did something more important. It marked the moment I stopped pretending everything was fine. The night I finally broke was also the night I finally told myself the truth. And once the truth was spoken, even in a whisper, there was no going back to the numbness that had kept me comfortable and empty. Something had shifted. Something fragile had been exposed. And I knew, with a certainty that frightened me, that my life would never feel the same again.
Chapter 6. The question that changed everything. The question came when I wasn't ready for it. I was sitting across from someone I trusted, not a stranger, not a savior, just a quiet presence who had listened without interrupting, without fixing, without rushing me toward conclusions. The room was calm, ordinary, almost disappointingly normal after the night I had unraveled. We sat in silence for a moment. Then the question arrived. When was the last time you felt alive? It wasn't asked dramatically. There was no emphasis, no judgment hidden in the tone, just curiosity, gentle, patient. The kind of question that doesn't demand an answer, it waits for one. My mouth opened instinctively, ready to offer something acceptable, something vague, a recent vacation, a successful moment at work, a laugh I remembered having. Nothing came. The silence stretched. I looked down at my hands, noticing how tightly I was holding them together. My fingers felt stiff, as if they were used to gripping instead of resting. "I don't know," I said finally. The words sounded small, but honest. The silence returned, heavier now. I searched my memory, scanning years instead of days, moments instead of milestones. I wasn't looking for happiness. I was looking for aliveness, the feeling of being present, engaged, connected to myself. There were flashes, incomplete and distant, a time when music made my chest ache in a good way, a moment when I spoke without rehearsing first, a version of myself that didn't ask permission to feel. Those moments felt real, but they didn't feel recent. "I think it's been a long time," I admitted. No one reacted, no one corrected me. The room stayed still, as if allowing the truth to settle where it belonged. That was when something shifted, not outwardly, not visibly, Internally, I had spent so long believing that something had been taken from me, that life or responsibility or circumstances had stolen my sense of self, that the world had demanded too much and left me empty in return. But sitting there, facing that simple question, I realized how incomplete that story was. My identity wasn't stolen, it was slowly abandoned. The realization landed quietly, but it carried weight. I thought back to all the moments when I chose ease over honesty, when I told myself I would return to myself later, when I dismissed my own needs because addressing them felt inconvenient, risky, unnecessary. Each time, the decision felt reasonable, one choice at a time, one compromise at a time, one silence at a time. There was no villain in that story, no single moment to blame, just a pattern. I had left myself behind gradually, believing I could always come back later. Later never came. I think I stopped listening to myself, I said slowly. Not because I didn't care, but because it felt easier not to. Easier to adapt than to resist. Easier to fulfill expectations than to question them. Easier to survive than to feel. The room felt warmer somehow, as if the air itself had softened. I realized then that the numbness I had been living with wasn't a failure, it was a coping mechanism, a way to function when listening to myself felt too overwhelming. That understanding didn't excuse anything, but it did remove the shame. I wasn't broken. I had been protecting myself in the only way I knew how at the time. The responsibility was still mine, but it no longer felt like a punishment. It felt like an invitation. What would it look like, the voice across from me asked gently, to start listening again? The question scared me more than the first one. Listening meant change. Change meant discomfort. Discomfort meant uncertainty. For years, I had structured my life around avoiding uncertainty, around minimizing risk, around staying manageable. Listening to myself threatened all of that. I don't know if I can, I admitted. That's okay. You don't have to know yet. I let that sink in. There was no demand to act immediately, no pressure to transform overnight, just the acknowledgement that something important had been neglected and could be returned to slowly. For the first time, responsibility didn't feel like blame. It felt like agency. I left the room later that day with no clear plan, no list of changes, no dramatic resolution. But something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer asking, "What's wrong with me?" I was asking, "What have I been avoiding hearing?" On the walk home, the world felt slightly sharper. Not brighter, not happier, just more present. I noticed details I usually overlooked: the way the light hit the sidewalk, the sound of footsteps behind me, the rhythm of my own breathing. It felt unfamiliar, and yet, strangely, right. That night, I lay in bed thinking about the question again. When was the last time you felt alive? This time, I didn't rush to answer it. I let it remain open, knowing that the answer wouldn't come from thinking harder, but from paying attention differently. I understood now that reclaiming myself wouldn't happen through force or guilt. It wouldn't come from punishing myself for what I hadn't done. It would come from showing up, from listening when something felt wrong instead of pushing through, from honoring discomfort instead of silencing it, from choosing presence over performance. The twist wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden revelation that changed everything, just a quiet truth finally acknowledged. I hadn't lost myself because life demanded too much. I lost myself because I believed my voice could wait. And now that I had heard it again, even faintly, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't ready to abandon myself any longer. Choosing myself didn't feel brave. It felt uncomfortable, awkward, wrong. The first time it happened, it was barely noticeable from the outside. Someone asked if I could take on an extra responsibility, something small, something I had done many times before without thinking. My instinct rose immediately. Of course, I can handle it. It's not a big deal. The words were already forming in my mouth when I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anxiety, not fear, recognition. I paused. "I can't this time," I said. The silence that followed felt heavy. The other person looked surprised, not offended, just unprepared. I waited for disappointment, for questions, for guilt to crash into me. It didn't. "Okay," they said simply. "Thanks for letting me know." That was it. I nodded, my heart pounding harder than it should have. As the conversation moved on, I sat with the aftershock of what I had just done. I hadn't explained. I hadn't apologized. I hadn't justified myself. And the world hadn't collapsed. The realization stayed with me longer than the conversation itself. Saying no didn't bring relief right away. It brought fear. My mind replayed the moment over and over, searching for damage. Did I sound selfish? Did I disappoint them? Will they ask again? The old patterns still lived inside me, loud and persistent. Choosing myself didn't erase them, it challenged them. Later that day, when someone asked how I was doing, I hesitated. "Fine" waited at the edge of my tongue. Instead, I said, "I'm tired." The honesty felt exposed, vulnerable, dangerous, but it also felt real. The person nodded, understanding flickering across their face. "Yeah," they said. "Me too." That was all. I had expected honesty to create distance. Instead, it created connection. The changes I made were small, almost invisible, but they were deliberate. I started leaving work on time, even when there was more I could do. I let messages sit unanswered when my energy was low. I stopped pushing through exhaustion as if it were a moral obligation. Allowing rest felt like a rebellion. The first evening I chose to do nothing, I sat on the couch feeling restless and uneasy. My mind searched for tasks, for proof of productivity. Without it, I felt exposed, as if I were wasting something valuable, time. I reminded myself that rest wasn't a reward, it was a requirement. Still, guilt crept in. I thought of all the things I should be doing, all the people who might need me, all the expectations I wasn't meeting. I stayed anyway. I let myself sit there uncomfortable and still until the feeling passed. It did pass, not quickly, not completely, but enough. I began to notice something subtle happening inside me. The tightness in my chest softened slightly. My thoughts slowed just enough for me to catch them before they spiraled. I started to feel the difference between obligation and desire. Sometimes I chose wrong. I overcommitted. I slipped back into old habits. I said yes when I meant no, then felt the familiar resentment rise. Instead of punishing myself, I paid attention. Why did I say yes? What was I afraid of? What did I need in that moment? The answers weren't always clear, but asking the questions changed how the mistakes felt. They became information instead of evidence of failure. Being honest about my feelings was harder. I had spent years minimizing them, smoothing them out so they wouldn't cause friction. Now, even small truths felt risky. "I don't have the energy for this today." That hurt more than I expected. "I need some space." Each sentence felt like stepping onto unstable ground. Sometimes people understood. Sometimes they didn't. Both outcomes were survivable. The fear didn't disappear.
It lingered, whispering warnings, predicting consequences. But alongside it, something else began to grow. Relief. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind that settles in your body when you stop fighting yourself. I slept better. Not longer, but deeper. I woke up less tense, my jaw unclenched, my shoulders looser. Small things started to matter again. Music, light, silence. There were moments when choosing myself felt selfish, even cruel, especially when someone else was disappointed or confused by the change. The guilt returned then, sharp and insistent. You're changing. You're letting people down. You're becoming difficult. I listened to the guilt without obeying it. I reminded myself that being available at the cost of myself wasn't kindness. It was self-erasure. Choosing myself felt wrong until it didn't. The wrongness faded gradually, replaced by something steadier, a sense of alignment, a feeling that my actions were finally matching my inner reality. I wasn't happier all the time. I was more honest, and that honesty brought a different kind of peace. One evening, as I sat alone with a cup of tea, I realized I hadn't felt the urge to disappear all day. The thought surprised me. I didn't celebrate it. I didn't analyze it. I just noticed. Growth didn't announce itself. It arrived quietly, in moments of restraint, in pauses before automatic responses, in choices that honored my limits, even when it felt uncomfortable. I was still afraid sometimes, still uncertain, still learning, but I was present, and that, I was beginning to understand, mattered more than perfection. Learning to choose myself again didn't make me fearless. It made me honest enough to stay. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough.
Chapter 8. I didn't find myself. I returned. I used to think finding myself would feel dramatic, like a sudden clarity, like a door opening all at once, like a moment where everything finally made sense. That wasn't how it happened. What came instead was quieter. I was standing in line at the grocery store one evening, holding a basket with just a few things inside. Nothing urgent, nothing planned. I wasn't rushing. I wasn't rehearsing conversations in my head. I wasn't thinking about what came next. I was just there. The realization surprised me. For so long, my mind had lived ahead of my body, anticipating, correcting, preparing. Now, for a brief moment, everything was in the same place. My thoughts, my breath, my hands. I felt present, not euphoric, not excited, present. And in that presence, something settled gently inside me. I hadn't lost myself. I had stepped away. There was a difference. Looking back, I could see it clearly now. My identity hadn't vanished during the years I spent prioritizing everything else. It hadn't been erased or broken or taken. It had waited, patiently, quietly. It waited while I learned how to survive. It waited while I learned how to be needed. It waited while I confused endurance with strength. I had assumed that returning to myself would require undoing everything, leaving, changing, starting over. But the truth was simpler and in some ways harder. Coming back meant staying. Staying present when things felt uncomfortable. Staying honest when silence felt safer. Staying with myself even when doubt resurfaced. Some days the old patterns tried to return. I felt the familiar pull to overcommit, to smooth things over, to disappear into usefulness. When that happened, I didn't panic. I noticed. I reminded myself that. Chapter 8. I didn't find myself. I returned. I used to think finding myself would feel dramatic, like a sudden clarity, like a door opening all at once, like a moment where everything finally made sense.
that wasn't how it happened. What came instead was quieter. I was standing in line at the grocery store one evening, holding a basket with just a few things inside. Nothing urgent, nothing planned. I wasn't rushing. I wasn't rehearsing conversations in my head. I wasn't thinking about what came next. I was just there. The realization surprised me. For so long, my mind had lived ahead of my body, anticipating, correcting, preparing. Now, for a brief moment, everything was in the same place. My thoughts, my breath, my hands. I felt present. Not euphoric, not excited. Present. And in that presence, something settled gently inside me. I hadn't lost myself. I had stepped away. There was a difference. Looking back, I could see it clearly now. My identity hadn't vanished during the years I spent prioritizing everything else. It hadn't been erased or broken or taken. It had waited, patiently, quietly. It waited while I learned how to survive. It waited while I learned how to be needed. It waited while I confused endurance with strength. I had assumed that returning to myself would require undoing everything, leaving, changing, starting over. But the truth was simpler and in some ways harder. Coming back meant staying. Staying present when things felt uncomfortable. Staying honest when silence felt safer. Staying with myself even when doubt resurfaced. Some days the old patterns tried to return. I felt the familiar pull to overcommit, to smooth things over, to disappear into usefulness. When that happened, I didn't panic. I noticed. I reminded myself that awareness was enough in that moment, that returning didn't mean never leaving again. It meant recognizing when I had and choosing differently next time. There was no finish line, just practice. I began to understand that my identity wasn't something I had to rebuild. It wasn't a project or a performance. It was a relationship, one I had neglected, but not destroyed. A relationship that could be repaired, slowly, gently, on my own terms. I started trusting myself in small ways, trusting that if something felt wrong, it deserved attention, trusting that rest wasn't laziness, trusting that my voice mattered even when it trembled. The world didn't change dramatically as a result. People still had expectations, responsibilities still existed, life still demanded effort. What changed was how I met it. I no longer tried to disappear to keep things running smoothly. I stayed visible, even when it felt vulnerable. I allowed myself to be human instead of dependable. And something unexpected happened. The fear that once ruled my choices softened, not because it disappeared, but because it no longer made my decisions for me. One evening as I sat by the window watching the light fade, I thought about the version of myself I had mourned so deeply, the one in the photograph, the one who felt alive without trying. I smiled softly. She wasn't gone. She had simply been waiting for me to come back without conditions, without guilt, without apology. I understood then that losing myself hadn't been a failure. It had been part of a longer journey, one that taught me what happens when you silence yourself for too long. The wisdom didn't come from the loss itself. It came from the return. I no longer measured my worth by how much I could carry. I measured it by how honestly I lived inside my own skin. That honesty didn't make life easier. It made it real. As I prepared for bed that night, moving through the familiar routine, I noticed how different it felt. The same actions, the same space, a different presence. I caught my reflection in the mirror and didn't rush past it. I looked at myself calmly, without judgment. There I was. Not perfect, not finished, but whole. I turned off the light and lay down, my body tired in a natural way, not depleted, not tense, just tired. Before sleep arrived, one thought settled gently into place, clear and steady. The day I lost myself was the day I learned I could come back. Not all at once, not without fear, but willingly. And that, I realized, was enough.